The morning bells of Blackmore chimed 7 times across the soot-laden sky as Evangeline Hartwell stood before the mirror in her boarding-house room, her gloved fingers trembling against the brass buttons of her traveling dress. The gray wool felt coarse against her skin, but it was the finest garment she owned, purchased with the last of her father's insurance money. In 3 hours, she would meet her intended husband for the first time. The arrangements had been made through letters, her guardian's careful script negotiating terms with Aldrich Blackwood, owner of the largest ironworks in northern England. At 22, she was considered nearly past marriageable age, her stutter making her an unwelcome burden in polite society. But Mr. Blackwood needed a wife to legitimize his growing fortune, and she needed security. The transaction was as cold and practical as the iron he forged. Evangeline pressed her lips together, practicing the words she would need to say. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Blackwood." Even alone, the consonants caught in her throat like hooks. She had learned to speak as little as possible, nodding and smiling when conversation flowed around her. It was safer that way. The coaching inn's common room buzzed with voices when she descended the narrow stairs, her single trunk bumping against the walls behind the porter. Men in dark coats huddled over steaming mugs of ale, their conversations punctuated by harsh laughter. She recognized the accents of mill workers, foundry supervisors, and merchants, all drawn to Blackmore by the promise of industrial prosperity. "Miss Hartwell." A thin man in spectacles approached her, his clothes marking him as a clerk. "I am Thomas Bramwell, Mr. Blackwood's secretary. He sends his regrets that urgent business prevents him from greeting you personally, but I am to escort you to Ravenshollow House immediately." Evangeline nodded, not trusting her voice. The dismissal stung, though she had not expected romance from this arrangement. Mr. Bramwell gestured toward the door, where a black carriage waited in the courtyard. The horses stamped impatiently, their breath forming clouds in the November air. As they traveled through Blackmore's winding streets, Evangeline observed the town that would become her home. Smoke poured from countless chimneys, casting a perpetual twilight over the narrow buildings. Women in threadbare shawls hurried along the cobblestones, baskets clutched to their chests. Children with smudged faces peered from doorways, their eyes too old for their years. The ironworks dominated the eastern horizon, its furnaces glowing like dragon's breath against the gray sky. "Mr. Blackwood employs near half the town," Mr. Bramwell said, following her gaze. "The works run day and night now, with the new government contracts for railway expansion. Your husband is quite the visionary." Evangeline managed a small smile. The word husband felt foreign on her tongue, even unspoken. She had never been courted, never danced at assemblies or received flowers from suitors. Her affliction had made her invisible to respectable men, a curiosity to be pitied or ignored. Ravenshollow House emerged from a grove of bare oak trees like something from a Gothic novel. The stone facade rose 3 stories, its windows staring down at them with vacant eyes. Ivy clung to the walls despite the season, and gargoyles perched on the corners of the roof, their expressions frozen in eternal snarls. It was impressive and terrible, exactly what she had expected from a man who commanded an industrial empire. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel drive, and Mr. Bramwell helped her alight. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a stern-faced woman in black bombazine. Her gray hair was pulled back severely, and her pale eyes assessed Evangeline with obvious disapproval. "Mrs. Fairfax, the housekeeper," Mr. Bramwell murmured. "She manages the household staff and will orient you to the house routines. Welcome to Ravenshollow, Miss Hartwell." Mrs. Fairfax's voice carried the authority of long service. "Mr. Blackwood is in his study attending to correspondence. You are to wait in the morning room until he summons you." Evangeline found herself installed in a bright chamber overlooking the gardens, her trunk deposited in the corner by 2 silent footmen. The furniture was expensive but cold, upholstered in pale green silk that matched the wallpaper. A fire burned in the grate, yet the room felt somehow cheerless. She sat on the edge of a chair, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed twice before heavy footsteps approached in the corridor. The door opened without ceremony, and Aldrich Blackwood entered. He was younger than she had imagined from his letters, perhaps 35, with broad shoulders that filled his dark coat. His hair was black as coal dust, combed back from a strong-featured face marked by determination and something harder. His eyes were the color of steel, and they studied her with the same calculating intensity she imagined he applied to business negotiations. "Miss Hartwell." His voice was deep, cultured, but carried an edge that made her pulse quicken. "I trust your journey was comfortable." Yes, sir. Thank you." The words emerged in halting fragments, and she saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. "I see. Your guardian mentioned difficulties with speech, but I had hoped the letters exaggerated the severity." He moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "No matter. I require a wife who understands discretion above all else. Your condition may prove advantageous in that regard." Evangeline stared at her gloved hands. She had known this marriage would be one of convenience, but his clinical assessment of her affliction felt like a physical blow. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "I understand my role, Mr. Blackwood." "Do you?" He turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "Ravenshollow House operates according to strict principles. The servants follow precise routines, household accounts are managed to the penny, and discretion is absolute. My business associates and their wives will judge you as a reflection of my standing in the community. Any irregularities would be most unwelcome." The weight of his expectations settled on her shoulders like a yoke. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Excellent. Mrs. Fairfax will explain the household schedules. We will be married by special license tomorrow morning in the drawing room, with only the necessary witnesses present. I have no time for elaborate ceremonies." He moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing, Miss Hartwell. The east wing of the house is my private domain. The servants are forbidden to enter without express permission, and I extend that prohibition to you as well. Is that understood?" Yes, sir." "Good. I will see you at dinner. Mrs. Fairfax will provide appropriate attire." He left without ceremony, and Evangeline sat alone with the ticking clock and the dying fire. The prohibition on the east wing struck her as oddly specific, but she pushed the thought aside. She was in no position to question her future husband's arrangements. Mrs. Fairfax returned within the hour, carrying an armload of black silk. "Mr. Blackwood's late wife's mourning dress," she explained, spreading the garment across the sofa. "It will require alterations, but it's suitable for the ceremony." Evangeline ran her fingers over the fine fabric. His late wife died in childbirth 2 years past, the infant as well. Mrs. Fairfax's expression softened slightly. "He hasn't spoken of them since. The mourning period ended 6 months ago, hence his decision to remarry." The revelation added another layer to the complexity of her situation. She was not just replacing a wife, but a woman who had died tragically young. The black silk seemed to whisper of secrets and sorrows she could not yet comprehend. That evening, she dined alone in the morning room while Mrs. Fairfax explained the household routines. Breakfast at 7, lunch at 1, dinner at 7. The servants, cook, 2 housemaids, a scullery girl, and the footman, followed rigid schedules. Mr. Blackwood often worked late in his study or traveled to the ironworks, sometimes remaining there overnight when urgent orders demanded attention. "The servants are not to be engaged in unnecessary conversation," Mrs. Fairfax continued. "They have their duties, and interruptions reduce efficiency. Mr. Blackwood values order above all else." Evangeline nodded, though the prospect of a silent house filled her with dread. At her guardian's modest home, she had at least enjoyed friendly exchanges with the single housemaid. Here, even casual human contact seemed forbidden. Sleep came fitfully that night in the grand four-poster bed that had belonged to the first Mrs. Blackwood. The mattress was comfortable, the linens fine, but the room felt haunted by its previous occupant. Evangeline lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house, creaking timbers, settling stones, and strange rhythmic noises from somewhere in the east wing that might have been machinery or something else entirely. The morning of her wedding dawned gray and cold. Mrs. Fairfax helped her into the altered mourning dress, which fitted well enough despite the macabre circumstances. In the mirror, she looked like a widow rather than a bride, her pale face ghostly above the black silk. The ceremony itself lasted less than 10 minutes. The local magistrate performed the rites in the drawing room while Mrs. Fairfax and Mr. Bramwell served as witnesses. Aldrich Blackwood spoke his vows in a steady voice, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder. When it came time for her responses, Evangeline managed to force out the words without stumbling, though her voice was barely audible. "By the authority vested in me by Her Majesty's government, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The magistrate closed his prayer book with a snap. "You may kiss the bride, Mr. Blackwood." Aldrich stepped forward and brushed his lips against her cheek, a perfunctory gesture that lasted barely a second. His skin was cold, and she caught the scent of coal smoke and something metallic that clung to his clothes. "Thank you, magistrate. Mrs. Fairfax will show you out." He turned to Evangeline, now his wife. "I have business at the works that cannot wait. We will discuss your new responsibilities this evening." And with that, he was gone, leaving her standing in her borrowed mourning dress while the witnesses filed out. Mrs. Fairfax began clearing away the few items that had been arranged for the ceremony: a simple bouquet of late roses, the magistrate's papers, a bottle of wine that had gone unopened. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Blackwood," the housekeeper said, though her tone carried no warmth. "I trust you will find your place here satisfactory." Mrs. Blackwood. The name felt as foreign as everything else in this strange house. Evangeline touched the simple gold band on her finger, a ring that had belonged to the previous bearer of that title. She was no longer Evangeline Hartwell, the stammering spinster from Surrey. She was Mrs. Aldrich Blackwood, mistress of Ravenshollow House, though she felt less equipped for the role than ever. The first test of her new position came that very afternoon. She was attempting to read in the library when raised voices echoed from the servants' hall below. Through the floor, she could hear Mrs. Fairfax's sharp tones and a younger woman's tearful responses. Curiosity overcame her natural timidity, and she made her way to the back stairs. "Told you to stay out of the east wing," Mrs. Fairfax was saying. "Mr. Blackwood's instructions were explicit." "I were only cleaning, ma'am." The voice belonged to one of the housemaids, Sarah, a girl of perhaps 16 with frightened eyes. "I heard noises, like someone calling for help, and I thought—" "You thought nothing!" "That is your problem, girl. You are not paid to think, only to follow orders. One more transgression and you'll find yourself on the street without reference." Evangeline descended the remaining steps and entered the servants' hall. Both women looked up in surprise at her appearance. Mrs. Fairfax immediately straightened, while Sarah bobbed a hurried curtsy. "Mrs. Blackwood," the housekeeper said stiffly, "I was just correcting a minor disciplinary matter. Nothing to concern yourself with." "What sort of noises?" Evangeline asked, addressing Sarah directly. The girl's eyes darted between them nervously. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but it sounded like someone crying, or maybe calling out. I couldn't make sense of it, but it didn't sound right." "Nonsense," Mrs. Fairfax interjected. "The girl has an overactive imagination. The East Wing contains Mr. Blackwood's private study and workshop, Any sounds would be mechanical in nature, equipment or ventilation systems. But Evangeline had heard those same rhythmic noises during the night, and they had not sounded mechanical to her. They had sounded disturbingly human. She studied Sarah's frightened face and made a decision that surprised herself. "Sarah, please continue with your duties. Mrs. Fairfax, I would like to review the household accounts after tea." It was a small assertion of authority, but Mrs. Fairfax's eyes narrowed slightly before she nodded. "Of course, Mrs. Blackwood, as you wish." Sarah curtsied again and hurried away, but not before shooting Evangeline a grateful look. It was a minor victory, but it felt significant. For the first time since arriving at Ravenshollow House, someone had looked at her with something other than pity or disapproval. That evening, Aldrich returned from the ironworks in a foul mood. His coat was dusted with soot, and his hands bore fresh burns from molten metal. He barely acknowledged her presence during dinner, responding to her tentative questions about his work with grunts or single-word answers. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "The new government contracts are demanding," he finally said, cutting into his beef with unnecessary force. "Quality standards have increased, delivery schedules shortened. I cannot afford distractions or inefficiencies." Evangeline interpreted this as a warning about her own behavior. She nodded and returned to her soup, the words she might have spoken dissolving in her throat. After dinner, he retreated to his study with a bottle of brandy and a stack of correspondence. Evangeline sat alone in the morning room, listening to the distant sounds of the night shift at the ironworks. Through the windows, she could see the glow of the furnaces painting the horizon red. It looked like a vision of hell itself. She was preparing for bed when she heard them again. Those strange rhythmic sounds from the east wing. They seemed louder tonight, more urgent. Without conscious thought, she found herself padding barefoot through the corridors, following the sounds to their source. The east wing was separated from the main house by a heavy oak door that stood slightly ajar. Evangeline hesitated, remembering Aldrich's prohibition, but the sounds drew her forward. She pushed the door open just wide enough to slip through. The corridor beyond was darker than the rest of the house, lit by only a few flickering gas lamps. The sounds were definitely coming from somewhere ahead, a rhythmic tapping or knocking, interspersed with what might have been muffled voices. Her heart hammered as she crept forward, her bare feet silent on the cold stones. The corridor ended at another door, this one firmly closed but not locked. The sounds were louder here, more distinct. Evangeline pressed her ear to the wood and held her breath. Tap, tap, tap. Pause, tap, tap. Pause, tap, 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 tap. It was definitely intentional, like someone tapping out a code or signal. Between the rhythmic sounds, she could hear what sounded like whispered conversation, though she could not make out the words. Her hand moved to the door handle of its own accord. "What are you doing here?" Evangeline spun around, her heart nearly stopping. Aldrich stood at the end of the corridor, his face dark with anger. He had moved with surprising stealth for such a large man, and his eyes blazed in the lamplight. I heard noises," she stammered, backing away from the door. Sarah said—" "Sarah has been dismissed." His voice was deadly quiet as he advanced on her. "She packed her things and left this afternoon, as will anyone else who cannot follow simple instructions." Evangeline's blood went cold. The girl's frightened face flashed through her memory, and she realized her small assertion of authority had accomplished nothing except to cost Sarah her position. "You will return to your room immediately," Aldrich continued, now close enough that she could smell the brandy on his breath. "You will not speak of this to anyone, and you will never enter the East Wing again. Am I understood?"
Yes,
she whispered, though something in his manner made her skin crawl. The sounds from behind the door had stopped, as if whoever was making them had heard the confrontation and fallen silent. "Good." He stepped aside to let her pass, but his eyes followed her retreat. "I married you for your discretion, Evangeline. Do not make me regret that decision." She fled to her room and locked the door behind her, though she doubted it would keep him out if he chose to enter. The confrontation had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. There was something in the East Wing that Aldrich was desperate to hide, something that had cost Sarah her livelihood and might cost others even more. As she lay in the darkness, Evangeline found herself thinking of the rhythmic tapping. It had seemed almost like a code, a message being transmitted through the walls. But who was sending it? And to whom? And what had happened to Sarah after her dismissal? The girl had no family in Blackmore, no resources to fall back on. Where would she go? The questions multiplied in her mind like shadows, each one darker than the last. She had married a stranger for security and respectability, but she was beginning to suspect that Ravenshollow House harbored secrets far more dangerous than her own stammering tongue. The East Wing called to her like a siren song, and she knew that despite Aldrich's threats, she would not be able to resist its pull forever. The wind howled around the house's towers, and somewhere in its voice, she thought she heard Sarah's frightened whisper. It sounded like someone calling for help. 3 days passed in suffocating routine after Sarah's dismissal. Evangeline moved through the house like a ghost in mourning silk, speaking only when absolutely necessary and avoiding the East Wing entirely. Mrs. Fairfax watched her with sharp eyes, reporting her movements to Aldrich each evening when he returned from the ironworks. The remaining servants, cook, scullery maid, and the 2 footmen, gave her nervous glances but offered no conversation beyond essential courtesies. On Thursday morning, Evangeline sat in the morning room attempting to embroider when Mrs. Fairfax entered carrying a sealed envelope. "A message from Mr. Blackwood," the housekeeper announced, her tone suggesting disapproval. "You are to read it immediately." Evangeline's fingers trembled as she broke the wax seal. Aldrich's handwriting was as controlled and precise as everything else about him. "My dear wife, business requires my presence in Manchester for the remainder of the week. You will confine yourself to the main house during my absence. Mrs. Fairfax has been instructed to monitor your activities and report any irregularities upon my return. The East Wing remains absolutely forbidden. I trust you understand the consequences of disobedience. Your husband." The letter felt like a prison sentence. Evangeline folded it carefully, aware of Mrs. Fairfax's scrutiny. "Mr. Blackwood is most concerned with maintaining order," the housekeeper said meaningfully. "Previous disruptions have proven costly." What happened to Sarah?" Evangeline managed to ask. Mrs. Fairfax's expression hardened. "Young women who cannot follow instructions rarely prosper in industrial towns. I suggest you focus on your own conduct rather than dwelling on the misfortunes of others." That afternoon, desperate for fresh air and human contact, Evangeline ventured into Blackmore's market square. The November wind cut through her wool cloak as she moved among the stalls, pretending to examine produce while listening to the conversations around her. The townspeople spoke of strikes at competing foundries, accidents in the mines, and the rising cost of bread. But when she approached vendors to make purchases, they fell silent, their eyes sliding away from hers with obvious discomfort. At the fishmonger's stall, she overheard 2 women whispering. "Another one gone missing," the older woman was saying. "Mary Hobson's girl, just vanished from the lodging house. That makes 3 this month." "Hush," her companion warned. "You know better than to spread such talk. Mr. Blackwood's people have ears everywhere." They noticed Evangeline listening and immediately moved away, their conversation dying. She stood frozen beside the display of silvery herring, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the weather. 3 girls missing. Sarah had been dismissed only days ago, and now she wondered if dismissal was the real fate that awaited servants who crossed Aldrich's rules. She purchased a small basket of apples to justify her presence and hurried home, her mind churning with dark possibilities. The phrase, "Mr. Blackwood's people have ears everywhere," echoed in her thoughts. It suggested a network of surveillance that extended far beyond Mrs. Fairfax's watchful eyes. That evening, alone in the vast dining room, Evangeline picked at her dinner while contemplating her situation. The house felt different without Aldrich's commanding presence, somehow both less oppressive and more ominous. The servants moved about their duties with mechanical precision, but she sensed an undercurrent of tension, as if they were all waiting for something to happen. After dinner, she retired to the library, hoping to lose herself in a novel. The room was one of the few spaces in Raven's Hollow House that felt welcoming, with its leather-bound volumes and comfortable chairs arranged before the fireplace. She had discovered that the previous Mrs. Blackwood had been an avid reader, her name inscribed in delicate script on the fly-leaves of dozens of books. Evangeline was examining a volume of poetry when a loose page fluttered to the floor. She retrieved it, expecting to find pressed flowers or bookmarks, but instead discovered a folded letter in feminine handwriting. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the careful script as matching the inscriptions in the books. "My dearest sister, I can bear the silence no longer. The sounds from the east wing grow louder each night, and I fear for my sanity, if not my safety. Aldrich forbids me to investigate, claiming it is merely machinery, but no machine weeps as these voices do. I have tried to speak with the servants, but they are too frightened to confide in me. Even Mrs. Fairfax acts as though she hears nothing unusual. I suspect there are others in this house, others who should not be here. The consumption of provisions far exceeds what our household should require, and I have noticed clothing in the laundry that belongs to none of us. When I questioned the cook, she became so agitated that I feared she might faint. I have resolved to discover the truth, whatever the cost. If something should happen to me, please know that I tried to help them. The sounds haunt my dreams, Catherine. They sound like souls in torment. Your loving sister, Margaret." Evangeline's hands shook as she finished reading. Margaret Blackwood had heard the same sounds, had suspected the same dark secrets, and then had died in childbirth. The timing seemed too convenient, too neat. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her bodice, her heart hammering against her ribs. The revelation cast everything in a new light. Sarah's dismissal, the missing girls from town, the prohibition on the East Wing, it all pointed to something far more sinister than industrial secrecy. But what could she do with the knowledge? She was alone in this house, surrounded by servants who reported to Mrs. Fairfax, married to a man who valued silence above all else. That night, she lay in bed listening to the familiar rhythmic sounds from the East Wing. They seemed louder now, more insistent, as if whoever made them sensed that someone was finally listening. The tapping came in distinct patterns, 3 short, 3 long, 3 short again. Even with her limited education, Evangeline recognized it as the maritime distress signal she had read about in shipping news. Someone was asking for help. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Evangeline was taking tea in the morning room when Mrs. Fairfax announced the arrival of Dr. Cornelius Ashford, the town physician. He was a distinguished man in his 50s with kind eyes and gentle manners that immediately put her at ease. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, bowing slightly, "I hope you will forgive the presumption of calling without invitation. I served as physician to your predecessor, and wish to offer my services to you as well." Thank you, Dr. Ashford. That is most considerate." His expression softened at her stammer. "Please do not be embarrassed. I have treated many patients with similar conditions. Often they are the most perceptive and intelligent individuals I encounter, their minds simply working faster than their tongues can follow." It was the first kind word anyone had spoken to her since arriving in Blackmore, and Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes. She gestured for him to sit, and Mrs. Fairfax reluctantly withdrew after offering refreshments. "I must ask, Doctor," Ashford said once they were alone, "how are you finding life at Raven's Hollow House? The transition from single life to marriage can be challenging." Something in his tone suggested deeper concerns. Evangeline studied his face, noting the worry lines around his eyes. "It is different than I expected. she admitted carefully. Margaret Blackwood said much the same thing when I first met her. A lovely young woman, though troubled by strange fancies near the end. She spoke of hearing voices, of people who shouldn't exist. He paused meaningfully. I hope you have not been similarly affected. Evangeline's breath caught. What sort of voices? Crying, calling for help, tapping sounds that seemed to follow patterns. I attributed it to the strain of pregnancy affecting her nerves, but after her death. He trailed off, then fixed her with an intense stare. Mrs. Blackwood, if you should ever need assistance, or simply someone to listen without judgment, please do not hesitate to call upon me. I live above the apothecary shop in Market Street. Before she could respond, Mrs. Fairfax returned with the tea service. Dr. Ashford smoothly shifted the conversation to general health matters, but his message was clear. He suspected something was wrong at Ravenshollow House, and he was offering himself as an ally. After he left, Evangeline found herself energized for the first time since her arrival. She was not alone. Doctor. Ashford believed Margaret's stories, and more importantly, he was willing to help. The knowledge gave her courage to take a dangerous step. That afternoon, while Mrs. Fairfax was occupied with household accounts, Evangeline made her way to the servants' quarters. The narrow hallways above the kitchen were cramped and poorly lit, smelling of cooking grease and carbolic soap. She found the cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Bramble, kneading bread in the small preparation room. Mrs. Blackwood. The woman looked up in alarm, flour dusting her apron. Is there something wrong? Should I fetch Mrs. Fairfax? No, please. I only wanted to ask. Evangeline took a breath, steeling herself. The provisions for the house. Do they seem adequate for our number? Mrs. Bramble's face went pale. She glanced nervously toward the door, then leaned closer. Begging your pardon, ma'am, but that's not a proper question for the likes of me to answer. Please, Evangeline pressed. I need to know. The cook's hands stilled on the dough. For a moment, she seemed to wrestle with herself, fear and conscience warring in her expression. Finally, she whispered, There's more mouths fed than should be, ma'am. More by far, but I daren't say where they are or who they might be. Mrs. Fairfax would have my head, and Mr. Blackwood. She shuddered. The East Wing. Mrs. Bramble's silence was answer enough. She returned to her kneading with violent intensity, her face closed off. I've said nothing, ma'am. Nothing at all. Evangeline left her to her work, but the confirmation sent her pulse racing. There were indeed people hidden somewhere in the East Wing. People who required food, but whose presence had to remain secret. The missing servant girls, the sounds Margaret had heard, the distress signals tapped through the walls, it all painted a horrifying picture. That evening, she attempted to eat dinner normally while her mind raced through possibilities. What could Aldrich be doing with these hidden people? Were they prisoners? Workers kept in terrible conditions? Something worse? And what had really happened to Margaret Blackwood when she grew too curious? As darkness fell, Evangeline made a decision that would change everything. She could not live with uncertainty any longer, could not ignore the pleading taps that echoed through the walls each night. She would discover the truth, whatever the cost. She waited until the house settled into its nighttime rhythms, then slipped from her room wearing only her nightgown and a shawl. The corridors were dark, save for the occasional gas lamp burning low, and her bare feet made no sound on the carpet. She carried Margaret's letter in one hand and a single candle in the other, its flame guttering in the drafts. The door to the East Wing stood closed, but unlocked. Evangeline hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open and stepping into the forbidden territory. The corridor beyond was even darker than she remembered, and the rhythmic sounds were immediately audible. Not just tapping now, but whispered voices, and what sounded like muffled sobbing. She followed the sounds deeper into the wing, past doors that stood firmly locked, until she reached the chamber where she had encountered Aldrich before. This time, she did not hesitate. She grasped the handle and slowly opened the door. The scene that greeted her was beyond her worst imaginings. The room had been converted into a makeshift dormitory, with perhaps a dozen thin mattresses arranged on the floor. Young women huddled on them. Some she recognized as former servants from various households in town. Others were strangers with hollow eyes and faces marked by desperation. They looked up at her approach with mixtures of hope and terror.
Please,
one of them whispered. Sarah, barely recognizable after only a few days.
please help us.
He keeps us here, makes us work in the tunnels below, says we can't leave until we've paid our debts, but the debts only grow larger. Evangeline's candle flame wavered as her hand shook. What tunnels? Sarah pointed to a narrow staircase in the corner of the room. Down there. Mining operations, he calls them. But it's not coal or iron he's after. It's something else, something he sells to buyers who come in the night. We're dying down there, ma'am. The dust, the chemicals, 3 girls have perished already. Before Evangeline could respond, heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor behind her. The women on the mattresses shrank back in terror, and Sarah's face went white as ash. He's returned early, she breathed. God help us all. Evangeline blew out her candle and pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give her away. Through the crack in the door, she saw Aldrich's silhouette approaching, his face thunderous with rage. Behind him walked 2 men she didn't recognize, rough-looking individuals with the bearing of hired muscle. "Search every room," Aldrich commanded in a voice like winter steel. "Someone has been asking questions in town, and now my wife has been seen speaking with Dr. Ashford. I will not tolerate security breaches." Evangeline realized with growing horror that her investigation had been discovered. Someone had reported her conversation with the cook, her visit from Dr. Ashford, perhaps even her presence in the East Wing at this very moment. She was trapped in a room full of evidence that could destroy Aldrich's carefully constructed facade, with nowhere to run and no way to explain her presence. The footsteps grew closer, and she heard the jangle of keys. In moments, they would open the door and find her. The women on the mattresses watched her with desperate eyes, and she realized that her discovery would not only doom her, but seal their fates as well. Whatever Aldrich was planning for her, it would be far worse for them. As the key turned in the lock, Evangeline made a desperate decision. She stepped away from the wall and into the center of the room, facing the door with Margaret's letter clutched in her trembling hand. When Aldrich entered with his companions, she was waiting for him, her chin raised despite her terror. "Good evening, husband," she said, and for once her voice did not stammer. Aldrich's face transformed into a mask of cold fury as he took in the scene. His wife standing among the captive women, Margaret's letter visible in her hand, the evidence of his secret operation laid bare. The 2 men behind him shifted nervously, their hands moving to weapons concealed beneath their coats. "You disappoint me, Evangeline." His voice carried the quiet menace of a man accustomed to absolute control. "I had hoped your affliction would make you more compliant." "Margaret wasn't compliant either," Evangeline replied, surprised by her own boldness. The letter trembled in her grip, but she held his gaze. "She discovered your secret before she died." "Margaret died in childbirth, as you well know." But something flickered in his eyes, a brief crack in his composure. Her mind was affected by pregnancy. She imagined things that did not exist. "Like these women? Like the tunnels below?" Evangeline gestured to the cowering figures around her. "Sarah told me about the mining operation. What are you digging for?" Aldrich stepped closer, his presence filling the small room like a gathering storm. "You have seen too much, my dear wife. But perhaps that can be remedied. He nodded to one of his companions. Mr. Thorne, please escort the ladies back to their quarters. Mrs. Blackwood and I have private matters to discuss. The man called Thorne moved forward with practiced efficiency, herding the women toward the staircase. Sarah caught Evangeline's arm as she passed.
The blue stones, she whispered urgently.
He makes us dig for blue stones that glow in the dark. Buyers come from London, from abroad. They pay fortunes for them. Before Evangeline could respond, Thorne roughly pulled Sarah away. The women disappeared down the narrow stairs, their footsteps echoing in the depths below. Soon, only Evangeline remained with Aldrich and his second companion, a scarred man with dead eyes who watched her like a predator, evaluating prey. Rare earth minerals, Aldrich said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Quite valuable to certain industrial applications. The government has recently developed an interest in them for military purposes. My ironworks provide the perfect cover for extraction operations. Using slave labor, Evangeline accused. Using women who would otherwise starve in the streets. I provide food, shelter, and purpose. Many consider it generous. His tone remained maddeningly calm. Of course, the work requires discretion. Industrial espionage is common, and my competitors would love to discover my sources. Margaret found out. That's why she really died. For the first time, genuine anger flashed across Aldrich's features. Margaret died because she could not mind her own affairs. She grew obsessed with imagined injustices, threatened to contact authorities, to create public scandals. The strain affected her health, weakened her constitution. When labor began prematurely, he didn't finish the sentence, but Evangeline understood. Margaret had been murdered, perhaps poisoned or subjected to some trauma that triggered fatal complications. The official cause of death, childbirth, provided perfect cover. I will not make Margaret's mistakes, Aldrich continued. You will return to your rooms and forget what you have seen tonight. Tomorrow, Doctor, Ashford will receive word that you have suffered a nervous collapse, requiring extended treatment in a private sanitarium. You will simply disappear until such time as your memory proves more reliable. The threat chilled her blood. A private sanitarium meant indefinite imprisonment, possibly drugged into compliance or worse. She thought of the women in the tunnels below, slowly dying from exposure to toxic minerals, while Aldrich profited from their suffering. People will ask Q questions, she said desperately. Dr. Ashford already suspects something. Dr. Ashford is an old man with romantic notions about medical ethics. He can suspect all he likes, but he has no proof of wrongdoing. Industrial accidents happen frequently in towns like Blackmore. Sometimes they claim entire households. The implied threat hung heavy in the air. Evangeline's mind raced. She was trapped, outnumbered, with no allies except a possibly sympathetic doctor who might already be marked for elimination. But Margaret's letter had mentioned something else. Clothing in the laundry that belonged to none of the official household. If there were other captives, there might be other secrets, other leverage she could use. The children, she said suddenly, remembering the conversation in the market square. You're not just taking servant girls. There are children down there, too. Aldrich's expression darkened further. Small hands are useful for delicate work. Orphans, street children, no one misses them. The casual admission of child slavery made Evangeline's stomach lurch. These weren't just economic crimes, but monstrous violations of human dignity. She thought of her own powerless childhood, the way adults had controlled every aspect of her existence, and felt a surge of protective fury. I won't let you continue this, she said, her stammer disappearing in the heat of anger. You have no choice in the matter. Aldrich gestured to his companion. Mr. Garrett will escort you to your rooms. In the morning, we will implement new arrangements for your care. But as Garrett stepped forward, a commotion erupted from the stairwell. Shouts echoed up from the tunnels below, followed by the sound of running feet. Thorne's voice rose above the chaos, calling for immediate assistance. What now? Aldrich muttered, his attention momentarily diverted. The distraction was all Evangeline needed. She darted past Garrett toward the door, Margaret's letter clutched to her chest. Behind her, she heard Aldrich curse and give chase, but she had gained precious seconds of advantage. The corridors of the East Wing seemed to stretch endlessly as she ran, her bare feet slipping on the cold stones. Behind her, heavy footsteps pounded in pursuit, and she could hear Aldrich shouting orders to his men. She reached the main door of the East Wing and burst through into the familiar territory of the house proper. But where could she go? The front door would be locked and guarded. The servants' quarters offered no sanctuary. Mrs. Fairfax would hand her over immediately. Her only hope lay in reaching Dr. Ashford, but the doctor lived in town, miles away through dark streets filled with Aldrich's allies. She stumbled into the library, her chest heaving from exertion and terror. The room was dark, except for dying embers in the fireplace, and for a moment she considered hiding among the tall shelves of books. But they would search every room systematically. She needed a better plan. Margaret's books. The previous Mrs. Blackwood had been an avid correspondent, and if she had suspected her husband's activities, she might have documented them. Evangeline began pulling volumes from the shelves, searching for more hidden papers, more evidence that could expose Aldrich's crimes. In a collection of botanical texts, she found what she was looking for. Not letters this time, but detailed drawings. Margaret had sketched the layout of the underground tunnels, marking locations where she had observed unusual activity. The drawings showed a complex network extending far beyond Ravenshollow House, connecting to the ironworks and even reaching toward the center of town. More importantly, the sketches revealed multiple exit points. One tunnel emerged near the old cemetery, another at the abandoned mill by the river. If she could reach the tunnels without being caught, she might escape through one of these alternative routes. Footsteps approached the library door. Evangeline stuffed Margaret's drawings into her bodice alongside the letter and moved toward the tall windows facing the garden. The glass was old and warped, secured by simple latches that opened with surprising ease. Cold November air rushed into the room as she climbed through the window, her nightgown catching on the frame. She dropped into the garden just as the library door burst open behind her. Aldrich's voice roared her name, but she was already running across the frost-covered lawn toward the shadowy bulk of the carriage house. The grounds of Ravenshollow House were extensive, dotted with outbuildings and ornamental features that provided cover. Evangeline had explored them during her first days of marriage, when the confinement of the house had driven her to seek solitude outdoors. Now that knowledge served her well as she navigated between hedgerows and garden structures, staying ahead of her pursuers. Behind her, she could hear men spreading out across the grounds, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. Aldrich's voice carried clearly in the still air, directing the search with military precision. But she had one advantage. They expected her to flee toward town, toward help and civilization. Instead, she was heading for the cemetery, toward the tunnel entrance Margaret had documented. The old graveyard occupied a hill overlooking Blackmore, its weathered headstones casting long shadows in the moonlight. Evangeline had visited it once before, drawn by morbid curiosity about the town's history. Many of the graves were unmarked, anonymous burials of workers who had died in industrial accidents. Now she wondered how many of those accidents had been engineered by Aldrich to silence inconvenient witnesses. She found the tunnel entrance exactly where Margaret's sketch indicated, a small stone structure that looked like a maintenance shed, but opened to reveal stairs descending into darkness. The entrance was concealed behind overgrown ivy, nearly invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. The tunnels below were worse than she had imagined. The air was thick with chemical fumes and rock dust that burned her lungs with each breath. Crude oil lamps provided minimal illumination, casting dancing shadows on walls that wept with moisture. The sound of picks striking stone echoed from deeper passages, punctuated by coughing fits and whispered prayers. She followed the main passage, guided by Margaret's careful notations, until she reached a wider chamber that served as a staging area. Here she found them, dozens of women and children of various ages, all bearing the hollow-eyed look of prolonged captivity. They worked in shifts, she realized, some sleeping on thin blankets while others labored in the deeper tunnels. An older woman approached her, perhaps 30, though hardship had aged her prematurely. "You're the new wife," she said without surprise. "We heard about you from Sarah." "Came to see for yourself, did you?" "I came to help," Evangeline replied, though she had no idea how she could possibly accomplish such a thing. "Help?" The woman laughed bitterly. "There's no help for the likes of us. We're dead already, just taking our time about it. The bluestones poison everything they touch, the air, the water, our blood. Those who don't die of lung sickness waste away from something worse." Around the chamber, Evangeline could see the evidence of the woman's words. Many of the workers bore strange marks on their skin, dark veins visible beneath pale flesh, as if the mysterious minerals were literally poisoning them from within. Children as young as 8 or 9 showed the same symptoms, their small bodies ravaged by exposure to substances that should never touch human skin. "How long have you been here?" Evangeline asked. 2 years, maybe 3. Time loses meaning in the dark. I was a housemaid at the mayor's residence before Blackwood's men took me. Said I'd seen something I shouldn't have, though I never knew what. The woman's voice carried resignation rather than anger. "Most of us were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Wrong class, wrong connections, wrong questions asked." "There has to be a way out," Evangeline insisted. "Margaret drew maps, showed multiple exits. Margaret Blackwood." The woman's expression sharpened with interest. "We heard stories about her, how she tried to help before she died. You found her papers?" Evangeline nodded and pulled out the sketches. Several workers gathered around as she spread them on a wooden crate, their faces animated by the first hope they had shown. The maps were detailed and accurate, marking not only escape routes, but guard stations, storage areas, and what appeared to be Aldrich's private office in the depths of the complex. "Look here," the woman said, pointing to a passage marked in red ink. "This connects to the ironworks directly. If we could reach that point, we might access the main foundry floor during shift change. Too many witnesses for Blackwood to silence them all." But even as they planned, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the main tunnel. Aldrich had discovered her escape route and was following her into the underground maze. The workers scattered immediately, returning to their positions with practiced fear, leaving Evangeline alone with Margaret's evidence. She had perhaps minutes before they found her, and when they did, her fate would be sealed. But looking around at the poisoned faces of the captives, she realized that her own survival was less important than exposing this monstrous operation. These people deserved justice, deserved to see sunlight again, deserved to have their suffering acknowledged by the world above. Margaret's sketches included one final detail that Evangeline had overlooked in her haste: the location of Aldrich's underground office, where he kept records of his mineral sales and correspondence with buyers. If she could reach that office, gather concrete evidence of his crimes, she might accomplish what Margaret had died attempting. The footsteps were closer now, accompanied by the flicker of lantern light. Evangeline folded the sketches and pressed them into the hands of the older woman. "Take these to Dr. Ashford in Market Street," she whispered urgently. "Tell him everything. Make him understand." "What about you?" the woman asked. Evangeline looked toward the deeper tunnels, toward Aldrich's hidden office, and the evidence that could destroy him. "I have one more thing to do." Evangeline pressed deeper into the tunnel system, following Margaret's notations toward Aldrich's private office. The air grew thicker with each step, laden with chemical vapors that made her eyes water and her chest burn. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit echoed off stone walls. Aldrich's voice commanding his men to spread out, to check every passage, to bring her back alive if possible. The tunnel branched repeatedly, creating a maze that would have been impossible to navigate without Margaret's careful documentation. Evangeline passed storage chambers filled with wooden crates marked with foreign symbols, their contents glowing with an eerie blue phosphorescence that hurt to look at directly. The mysterious minerals Sarah had mentioned, rare earth elements that commanded fortunes from buyers who cared nothing for the human cost of extraction. She found Aldrich's office in a natural cavern that had been expanded and furnished with surprising comfort. A mahogany desk dominated the space, surrounded by filing cabinets, bookshelves, and even a Persian rug that seemed absurdly luxurious in this underground hell. Gas lamps provided steady illumination, their flames dancing in the toxic air. The desk drawers were locked, but Evangeline had learned desperation could overcome many obstacles. She used a letter opener to force the mechanisms, her hands shaking as she rifled through the contents. What she found exceeded her worst fears. Correspondence with buyers in London, Manchester, and even foreign capitals revealed the true scope of Aldrich's operation. The glowing minerals were indeed rare earth elements, but their application was far more sinister than simple industrial use. Military officials wrote of experiments with new types of explosives, while chemical companies described research into weapons that could poison entire regions. More damning still were the account books. Detailed records showed payments for workers, human beings bought and sold like livestock. Names she recognized from Blackmore's missing persons were listed alongside purchase prices, productivity ratings, and disposal dates. Margaret Blackwood's name appeared in the final entries, marked with a notation that made Evangeline's blood run cold. Permanent solution implemented. No further complications expected. She stuffed the most incriminating documents into her bodice, her nightgown now bulging with evidence. But as she reached for another file, footsteps approached the cavern entrance. There was nowhere to hide. The office was too well lit, too open. She pressed herself against the wall behind the door, hoping against hope that whoever entered might not search thoroughly. Aldrich himself stepped into the chamber, lantern in hand, his face grim with purpose. He was alone, having apparently left his men to search other passages. His eyes swept the room methodically, taking in the forced desk drawers and scattered papers with growing fury. "I know you're here, Evangeline," he said conversationally, setting his lantern on the desk. "Your breathing gives you away. The air down here is toxic. Your lungs are already damaged from exposure." She remained silent, fighting the urge to cough as chemical vapors seared her throat. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he continued, moving closer to her hiding spot. "Letters, perhaps? Account books? Evidence of crimes that exist only in your imagination?" When she still didn't respond, he laughed softly. "Margaret made the same mistake, you know. She thought documentation would protect her, that exposure would somehow matter to people who profit from ignorance. But who would believe such fantastic allegations? A stammering woman with a history of nervous disorders, making wild accusations against one of England's most successful industrialists. He was right, Evangeline realized with growing horror. Even with written proof, who would take her word against his? She was nobody, a spinster with a speech impediment who had married above her station. He was Aldrich Blackwood, employer of half the town, contributor to Parliament, pillar of the community. "Come out," he commanded, his patience wearing thin. "We will return to the house and discuss reasonable arrangements for your future care." "I am not an unreasonable man." Evangeline stepped from behind the door, the stolen documents crackling against her chest. In the lamplight, Aldrich looked older than she had ever seen him, his face etched with lines of exhaustion and something that might have been regret. "You could have lived comfortably," he said quietly. "Beautiful house, fine clothes, respected position in society." All I asked was silence. "At the cost of how many lives?" she managed to say, her voice stronger than expected. "Lives that would have been wasted anyway. Street children who would have starved or frozen in workhouses, servant girls who would have died in factory accidents or back-alley abortions. I gave them purpose, meaningful work contributing to England's industrial supremacy. The casual callousness of his justification enraged her. You gave them slavery and poison. You're killing children for profit. I am advancing the interests of the empire. The minerals we extract here will strengthen our military capabilities, secure our dominance over inferior nations. A few casualties are inevitable in any great enterprise. As he spoke, Evangeline became aware of new sounds from the tunnels beyond. Not the measured footsteps of Aldrich's men, but something more chaotic. Shouts echoed from multiple directions, accompanied by the clash of metal on stone and what sounded like running water. Aldrich heard it too, his head turning toward the cavern entrance with sudden concern. What the devil? The sound of rushing water grew louder, and Evangeline realized with shock that someone had breached the tunnel walls. Water was flooding into the underground complex, threatening to drown everyone trapped below. But who would do such a thing? The answer came in the form of a familiar voice calling from the tunnel. Mrs. Blackwood, are you down there? Dr. Ashford. Somehow the elderly physician had discovered the tunnel entrance and mounted a rescue operation. The flooding wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate attempt to force evacuation of the complex. This way! Evangeline shouted back, her voice echoing off stone walls. Aldrich's face twisted with rage. You contacted him! You've destroyed everything I built here! He lunged forward, his hands reaching for her throat. But Evangeline was ready. She dodged to one side, putting the desk between them, and grabbed the heavy letter opener she had used to force the locks. Stay back, she warned, though her grip on the makeshift weapon was unsteady. You think that toy frightens me? Aldrich sneered, circling the desk with predatory intent. I have killed before, my dear wife. Margaret was not my first, and you will not be my last. The admission confirmed her worst suspicions, but it also revealed something else. Aldrich was losing control, making mistakes born of desperation. The careful facade of respectability was cracking, exposing the monster beneath. Water began seeping into the cavern, dark and cold around their feet. The flooding was accelerating, and soon the entire tunnel system would be uninhabitable. Evangeline backed toward the entrance, keeping the letter opener between herself and her husband. The workers, she said. How will they escape? They won't, Aldrich replied matter-of-factly. Flooding accidents are common in mining operations. Tragic, but unavoidable. The official inquiry will find evidence of structural instability, perhaps improper excavation techniques. No one will ask inconvenient questions about who might have been trapped below. The casual planning of mass murder made her stomach lurch. Dozens of people would die to protect his secrets, women and children who had committed no crime except being powerless and vulnerable. I won't let you do this, she declared, surprising herself with her firmness. You have no choice. In a few minutes, this entire complex will be underwater. Dr. Ashford and his allies will retreat to save themselves, leaving us alone down here. And then, he pulled a small pistol from his coat, its metal surface gleaming in the lamplight. Then I will ensure that you never speak of what you have seen. The water was knee-deep now, carrying with it debris and the terrified cries of people trapped in flooded passages. Evangeline could hear Dr. Ashford calling her name, but his voice seemed farther away now, as if he was being forced to retreat by the rising water. She had failed. All her courage, all her desperate searching for evidence, and it would end with her death in this poisoned cavern. The documents pressed against her chest would dissolve in the flood, taking with them the only proof of Aldrich's crimes. The captive workers would drown in darkness, their suffering erased from history. But then she remembered something. Margaret's sketches had shown multiple exits, including one that led directly to the ironworks. If she could reach that passage, if she could somehow alert the night shift workers to what was happening below. The pistol wavered in Aldrich's hand as he struggled to maintain his footing in the rising water. Don't even think about running, he warned. I'm an excellent shot, even under difficult conditions. Then shoot me, Evangeline challenged, moving slowly toward the cavern entrance. "But my death won't solve your problems. Dr. Ashford knows I'm down here. He'll search until he finds my body, and when he does, he'll find the evidence I'm carrying." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Aldrich's eyes. He was a man accustomed to controlling every variable, but the flooding had introduced chaos into his carefully ordered world. The pistol shook in his grip as water swirled around his waist. Evangeline reached the tunnel entrance and paused, looking back at the man who had promised to be her husband and protector. "You could have been decent," she said quietly. "You have wealth, influence, intelligence. You could have used those gifts to help people instead of destroying them." "Sentiment is weakness," Aldrich snarled, raising the pistol. "Margaret learned that lesson too late." But as his finger tightened on the trigger, a new voice echoed from the flooded tunnel behind Evangeline. Young, desperate, but alive. "Mrs. Blackwood, this way! We found the ironworks passage!" Sarah. The girl had survived the flooding and was trying to guide her to safety. The sound of her voice galvanized Evangeline into action. She turned and plunged into the tunnel, the stolen documents clutched to her chest as Aldrich's pistol discharged behind her. The shot echoed deafeningly in the confined space, but the bullet went wide, chipping stone from the tunnel wall. Evangeline stumbled through waist-deep water, following Sarah's voice through the maze of flooded passages. Behind her, she could hear Aldrich crashing through the water in pursuit, his curses echoing off the walls. The passage to the ironworks was narrow and treacherous, carved through solid rock and now partially flooded. Sarah waited at a junction, her face pale but determined. With her were 3 other survivors, women who had somehow escaped the drowning trap. "The water's rising faster than we thought," Sarah gasped. "But if we can reach the foundry floor, there's dozens of workers up there. Too many for Blackwood to silence." They pressed forward together, the water now chest-deep and shockingly cold. Evangeline's nightgown dragged in the current, threatening to pull her under, but the other women supported her weight. Above them, she could hear the rumble of machinery and the shouts of night shift workers, oblivious to the drama unfolding below their feet. The passage ended in a vertical shaft, with rusted iron rungs leading upward. The water was almost to the tunnel ceiling now, giving them perhaps minutes before it became completely impassable. Sarah went first, her thin frame allowing her to climb quickly despite the flooding. As Evangeline reached for the ladder, Aldrich's hand closed on her ankle. He had followed them through the maze, his face a mask of fury and desperation. The pistol was gone, lost to the flood, but his grip was strong enough to drag her back into the depths. "If I cannot have silence," he snarled, "I will have death. We will all drown together in this tomb I created." But Evangeline had endured a lifetime of being underestimated, dismissed, controlled by others who thought her weakness made her helpless. The stuttering girl who had arrived at Ravenshollow House was gone, replaced by someone who had seen the worst of human evil and refused to submit to it. She kicked backward with all her strength, her heel connecting with Aldrich's face. His grip loosened enough for her to wrench free and grab the ladder rungs. As she climbed toward the surface, she could hear him below, struggling against the rising water that had become his weapon of choice. Sarah hauled her through the opening at the top of the shaft, and suddenly she was in the foundry floor. A vast space filled with glowing furnaces, massive machinery, and dozens of workers who stared in shock at the waterlogged figures emerging from the depths of their workplace. "Get help!" Sarah shouted to the nearest workers. "There's people trapped below! Send for the authorities!" Evangeline collapsed on the foundry floor, the stolen documents scattered around her like prophetic leaves. Her nightgown was torn and filthy, her hair plastered to her skull, but Margaret's evidence had survived. The proof of Aldrich's crimes lay exposed under the industrial lights, waiting for honest men to read and understand. As workers ran to summon help and begin rescue operations, Evangeline looked back at the flooded shaft. There was no sign of Aldrich. He had vanished into the poisoned waters that had claimed so many of his victims. Whether he had drowned or found some other escape route remained to be seen. But his empire of exploitation lay in ruins. The night was far from over, and there would be questions, investigations, and consequences she could barely imagine. But for the first time since arriving in Blackmore, Evangeline felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. Dawn broke gray and bitter over Blackmore as investigators swarmed through the flooded tunnels beneath the ironworks. Evangeline sat in the foundry manager's office, wrapped in a coarse blanket, watching through the window as uniformed constables carried waterlogged bodies from the depths below. Dr. Ashford hovered nearby, checking her pulse and breathing with the worried attention of a physician who had seen too much suffering. 17 dead, he reported quietly, returning from another consultation with the rescue teams. Mostly from drowning, though several show signs of prolonged poisoning from mineral exposure. The survivors number 23, including yourself and Sarah. Evangeline nodded numbly. The numbers felt simultaneously too large and too small. Too many lives lost, too few saved from Aldrich's underground hell. The documents spread across the manager's desk told a story of systematic exploitation that stretched back years, but the full extent would never be known. Too many records had dissolved in the flood. Too many witnesses had died in the darkness below. "Any sign of my husband?" she asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Dr. Ashford's expression darkened. "None yet. The tunnels are still partially flooded, and the rescue teams haven't accessed the deeper sections. He may have escaped through one of the passages that connect to his estate, or—" He didn't finish the thought, but Evangeline understood. Aldrich might have drowned like so many of his victims, claimed by the waters he had used as a weapon. The office door opened to admit Inspector Hartwell of the Yorkshire Constabulary, a stern man with graying whiskers who had arrived from Leeds on the morning train. Behind him came 2 officials from London, their expensive clothes and careful mannerisms marking them as government representatives sent to assess the political implications of the scandal. "Mrs. Blackwood," Inspector Hartwell said, settling heavily into a chair across from her. "I must ask you to recount the events of last night once more, for the benefit of our colleagues from Whitehall." Evangeline had already told her story 3 times, but she understood the necessity. The documents on the desk implicated not just Aldrich, but a network of buyers and officials who had profited from his operation. Letters from military contractors, chemical companies, and even members of Parliament created a web of complicity that reached the highest levels of English society. She began again, her voice growing stronger as she described discovering Margaret's letters, the captive workers, the poisonous minerals that glowed with unnatural light. The London officials listened with expressions of mounting concern, occasionally exchanging meaningful glances that suggested they recognized names mentioned in the correspondence. "These rare earth elements," the senior government man interrupted. "How extensive were the deposits? Did Mr. Blackwood indicate the scope of the mining operation?" The question struck Evangeline as oddly focused. Even as they discussed the human cost of Aldrich's crimes, these men seemed primarily concerned with strategic implications, whether England would lose access to valuable military resources now that the operation had been exposed. "I don't know the extent of the deposits," she replied carefully, "but the tunnels stretched for miles underground. There may be other sites, other operations we haven't discovered yet." Inspector Hartwell made notes while the London officials whispered among themselves. Through the window, Evangeline watched Sarah speaking with a newspaper reporter who had arrived from Manchester. The girl's face was animated as she described her captivity, her words carrying the weight of testimony that could not be dismissed or discredited. "There's another matter we must address," Inspector Hartwell said, drawing her attention back to the room. "The legal status of your marriage, given the circumstances. If Mr. Blackwood is indeed dead, you would inherit his estate, including the ironworks and any mineral rights associated with the property." The implications hit her like a physical blow, She had never considered the possibility of inheriting Aldrich's empire, but English law was clear on the matter of widows' rights. If her husband was dead, Ravenshollow House and everything associated with it would become her property, including the scenes of his crimes. "I want nothing from him," she said firmly. "Nothing built on such suffering." "Nevertheless," one of the London officials interjected, "the property exists and must be administered." The ironworks employ hundreds of workers who depend on wages for survival. Simply abandoning the facilities would create economic chaos in the region. Dr. Ashford stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Are you suggesting that Mrs. Blackwood should profit from her husband's murder of innocent people? That she should continue operating a business built on slave labor?" "I am suggesting," the official replied coldly, "that complex situations require careful consideration of all parties involved. The workers above ground committed no crimes and deserve protection. The mineral deposits have strategic importance to national security. These factors cannot be ignored in favor of emotional responses." The casual dismissal of the victim's suffering enraged Evangeline. These men saw only political and economic problems to be managed, not human lives destroyed by greed and cruelty. Their concern for the surviving ironworks employees was genuine, but limited. They would happily preserve jobs while ignoring the bones buried in the tunnels below. "What about justice for the dead?" she demanded, her stammer completely absent in her fury. "What about prosecution of the buyers who profited from slavery? What about ensuring this never happens again?" The London officials exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Justice will be served within appropriate parameters," the senior man said carefully. "But we must also consider the broader implications. Public scandal of this magnitude could undermine confidence in English industry, damage trade relationships, create political instability." "So you intend to cover it up, Doctor?" Ashford accused. "We intend to handle the matter with discretion appropriate to national interests," came the reply. Evangeline felt a familiar helplessness rising in her chest, the same sensation that had plagued her throughout childhood when adults made decisions about her life without consulting her wishes. But this time was different. This time, she held evidence that could expose not just Aldrich's crimes, but the corruption that enabled them. "I have names," she said quietly, causing all conversation to stop. "Letters from buyers, invoices, correspondence with officials. Margaret documented everything before she died, and I found additional records in Aldrich's office. If you attempt to minimize this scandal, I will ensure the complete truth reaches the newspapers." The threat hung heavy in the air. The London officials' faces hardened with calculation as they weighed the costs of cooperation against the risks of confrontation. Inspector Hartwell looked between them with obvious discomfort, caught between his duty to investigate crimes and pressure from his superiors to consider political necessities. "Mrs. Blackwood," the senior official said finally, "you have suffered tremendous trauma. Perhaps it would be wise to consider your options carefully before making decisions that could have far-reaching consequences." The veiled threat was unmistakable, but Evangeline had already faced death in the tunnels below. Government intimidation seemed almost quaint by comparison. "My options are quite clear," she replied. "I can cooperate with a genuine investigation that honors the memory of those who died, or I can take my evidence to the press and let public outrage force accountability." Before anyone could respond, commotion erupted outside the office window. Shouts echoed across the foundry yard as rescue workers emerged from a tunnel entrance, supporting a figure between them. Even at a distance, Evangeline recognized the broad shoulders and dark hair of her husband. Aldrich Blackwood was alive. His clothes were torn and waterlogged. His face bore cuts from his passage through flooded tunnels. But he moved under his own power. As the rescue workers brought him toward the foundry building, his eyes found the office window and locked onto Evangeline's face. Even from 50 yards away, she could see the cold calculation in his gaze. "Remarkable," one of the London officials murmured. "Mr. Blackwood's survival complicates matters considerably." Inspector Hartwell was already moving toward the door. I'll take him into custody immediately. The evidence against him is overwhelming. Wait, the senior official commanded. Let us speak with Mr. Blackwood before any formal proceedings begin. There may be arrangements that serve everyone's interests. The suggestion sickened Evangeline. Even now, with bodies being pulled from flooded tunnels, these men were considering deals and compromises that would let Aldrich escape justice. She watched through the window as her husband was escorted into the building below, his bearing proud despite his bedraggled appearance. Within minutes, he would be in this very office, facing the evidence of his crimes. But she realized with growing dread that evidence meant nothing without the will to act upon it. The same system that had ignored the disappearance of servant girls and street children would find ways to protect a man whose connections reached into the highest levels of government. I want to speak with him, she announced, surprising everyone in the room. Dr. Ashford looked alarmed. Evangeline, that's not advisable. The man tried to kill you. He's still my husband under law, she replied, though the words tasted bitter. And I have questions that only he can answer. The London officials nodded approvingly, perhaps seeing opportunities for negotiation. Inspector Hartwell appeared less enthusiastic, but couldn't deny her legal right to confer with her spouse. Dr. Ashford simply looked worried, his medical training telling him that confronting trauma so directly could be dangerous. Heavy footsteps approached in the corridor outside. Evangeline straightened in her chair, the stolen documents within easy reach. Whatever happened next, she was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived at Ravenshollow House seeking security and acceptance. That person had died in the tunnels below, replaced by someone who understood the true cost of silence. The door opened, and Aldrich entered under police escort. His eyes swept the room, taking in the officials, the scattered evidence, and finally settling on Evangeline herself. When he spoke, his voice carried the same authoritative tone that had once made her stammer with nervousness. "My dear wife," he said, as if greeting her after a normal day at the ironworks. "I trust you are recovering from your ordeal. Underground floods can be quite traumatic for those unaccustomed to industrial hazards." The casual dismissal of what she had witnessed, the attempt to reframe mass murder as an industrial accident, revealed that Aldrich had not given up. Even captured, even facing irrefutable evidence, he intended to fight for his freedom, using the same tools that had served him before. Money, influence, and the willingness of powerful men to protect their own interests. But Evangeline was no longer impressed by his performance. She had seen him in his underground kingdom, watched him calculate the value of human lives in terms of profit margins. The mask of respectability had been torn away, revealing the monster beneath. "Tell them about the children," she said quietly. Aldrich's composure flickered for just an instant, long enough for everyone in the room to notice. Then his expression smoothed again, but the damage was done. That moment of revealed guilt would haunt whatever defense he attempted to construct. "I'm afraid my wife has been severely traumatized," he said, addressing the officials rather than responding to her directly. "The flood, the darkness, the fear, such experiences can create false memories, imagined horrors. I'm sure medical examination will confirm that her perceptions have been compromised." It was a clever strategy, one that played on centuries of legal precedent dismissing women's testimony as inherently unreliable. But this time, physical evidence supported her words. The documents on the desk, the survivor testimonies, the bodies being recovered from the tunnels, all painted a picture that couldn't be explained away as feminine hysteria. "The medical examination has already taken place, Doctor," Ashford announced, stepping forward with obvious anger. "Mrs. Blackwood shows signs of chemical exposure consistent with the toxic environment you created below ground. Her testimony is entirely credible." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If the survivors' accounts were medically verified, if the physical evidence supported accusations of systematic abuse, even the most corrupt officials would find it difficult to arrange Aldrich's escape from justice. Evangeline watched her husband's face as he realized his position was not as secure as he had assumed. The government men who might have protected him were reassessing the political costs of association with his crimes. Inspector Hartwell was building a case that would be difficult to dismiss. Most importantly, she was no longer the silent, stammering wife he had married for her discretion. "You could tell the truth," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "Confess your crimes, reveal the names of your buyers, help us ensure this never happens again. It won't bring back the dead, but it might prevent future victims." Aldrich studied her face for a long moment, and she saw something she had never expected. A flicker of what might have been respect. Perhaps even admiration for the woman she had become through adversity. "You have grown quite formidable, my dear," he said finally. "Margaret would have been proud." It was the closest thing to an admission she was likely to receive, and it carried the weight of acknowledgement. He knew he was caught, knew his empire had crumbled, but he would not go quietly into the darkness he had created for others. The negotiations that followed would determine not just Aldrich's fate, but the broader question of how English society would confront the evil that had flourished in its shadows. Evangeline held the key evidence, but she was no longer naive enough to believe that evidence alone would guarantee justice. The real battle was just beginning. 6 months later, Evangeline stood before the House of Commons Select Committee on Industrial Practices, her voice clear and unwavering as she delivered testimony that would reshape English labor law. The great chamber buzzed with nervous energy as members of Parliament shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the revelations that had emerged from what newspapers now called the Blackmore atrocity. "The systematic exploitation documented in these proceedings," she concluded, gesturing to the stack of evidence that had grown far beyond Margaret's original letters, represents not isolated criminal behavior, but a failure of oversight that enabled widespread abuse. We must ask ourselves, how many other operations exist in the shadows of our industrial progress? The committee chairman, Lord Pemberton, cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mrs. Blackwood, the committee appreciates your unique perspective on these matters. However, we must balance concerns for worker welfare against the practical necessities of maintaining England's competitive position in global markets." It was the same argument Evangeline had heard repeatedly over the past months. The suggestion that reform must be gradual, measured, careful not to disrupt the economic foundations that supported the empire. She had learned to recognize it as code for preserving profitable arrangements, regardless of human cost. "My lord," she replied, her stammer now completely absent even in formal settings, "I would suggest that England's true competitive advantage lies in demonstrating that industrial progress and human dignity are not mutually exclusive. The buyers who profited from my husband's operation were as much victims of a corrupt system as the workers themselves." The statement sent ripples through the gallery, where newspaper reporters scribbled furiously. In the months since Aldrich's trial and conviction, Evangeline had become something unprecedented in English society. A woman whose testimony carried weight in masculine domains of law, politics, and industry. Her transformation from silent bride to public advocate had captured the imagination of reformers while terrifying traditionalists. Aldrich himself sat in Pentonville prison, serving a sentence of 25 years hard labor for multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. His conviction had been secured not through governmental pressure, but through the power of survivor testimony amplified by press coverage that made suppression impossible. The London officials who had sought to minimize the scandal found themselves forced to pursue justice or face public outrage. The trial had revealed the full extent of the conspiracy. Military contractors, chemical companies, and even members of Parliament had been implicated in purchasing minerals extracted through slave labor. Some faced prosecution, others resigned in disgrace, and a few simply disappeared from public life as their reputations crumbled under scrutiny. Dr. Ashford entered the committee chamber as Evangeline finished her testimony, nodding approvingly at her performance. Over the past months, he had become more than her physician. He served as advisor, friend, and occasionally surrogate father figure as she navigated her new role in public life. "Masterfully done," he murmured as they left Westminster. "Lord Pemberton looked positively green when you mentioned competitive advantage. Nothing terrifies the establishment quite like the suggestion that reform might actually be profitable." They walked along the Thames in comfortable silence, watching boats navigate the muddy waters. London felt different now than it had 6 months ago, more aware of the darkness that lurked beneath its prosperity, more willing to ask uncomfortable questions about the sources of its wealth. "Any word from Blackmore?" Dr. Ashford asked eventually. Evangeline smiled. "Sarah writes regularly. The new factory cooperative is exceeding production targets, and they've received inquiries from investors in Manchester and Birmingham. Apparently, treating workers as human beings rather than machinery produces remarkable results." The transformation of Aldrich's ironworks had been Evangeline's most challenging decision. Rather than simply closing the facility and leaving hundreds unemployed, she had donated the property to a trust managed by former employees. The poisoned tunnels had been permanently sealed, but the surface operations continued under worker ownership, proving that industrial enterprise could function without exploitation. The legal battle over her inheritance had been complex, with various parties claiming portions of Aldrich's estate. But public sympathy for the silent bride, who had exposed the scandal, made it politically impossible to deny her legitimate claims. She had used her inheritance not for personal luxury, but to establish schools, medical facilities, and housing cooperatives in communities affected by industrial abuse. "And the mineral rights?" Dr. Ashford pressed. "Transferred to the Crown with strict stipulations about extraction methods and worker protections. If the government wishes to access those deposits, they must do so ethically, or not at all." Evangeline's expression hardened slightly. "I will not allow another generation to suffer for the sake of strategic resources." They paused at Westminster Bridge, watching Parliament's towers reflect in the river's surface. The building housed men who would decide whether the reforms proposed by the Select Committee became law or remained good intentions. Some were allies, convinced by testimony and evidence that change was necessary. Others remained committed to preserving systems that had enriched them for generations. "Do you think it will be enough?" Dr. Ashford asked quietly. "The committee report, the new regulations, the public attention. Will it prevent another Blackmore?" Evangeline considered the question carefully. In the months since her ordeal, she had learned that systematic change required more than exposing individual crimes. It demanded transformation of attitudes, institutions, and assumptions that ran deeper than any single scandal. "Not entirely," she admitted. "There will always be men like Aldrich who see others as resources to be consumed. But perhaps we can make such behavior more difficult, more expensive, more likely to be detected and punished." A newsboy's cry echoed across the bridge. "Extra edition! Parliament votes on factory reform. Read about the silent bride's victory." Evangeline winced at the nickname that had followed her since the trial. She understood its symbolic power, the woman who had found her voice by refusing to remain silent about injustice. But it reduced her to a convenient narrative, obscuring the complex realities of institutional change. "You've become quite the celebrity, Doctor," Ashford observed with amusement. "I never wanted celebrity. I wanted justice for people who couldn't speak for themselves. And you've achieved something perhaps more important. You've shown that such people can find voices, can demand accountability from those who would exploit them. The workers at Blackmore don't call you the silent bride. They call you the one who listened." The distinction mattered. Evangeline had indeed learned to speak without stuttering, to command attention in rooms full of powerful men, to translate private suffering into public policy. But her greatest achievement had been simpler. She had heard the tapping through the walls and refused to ignore what it meant. As evening approached, they made their way back toward Dr. Ashford's lodgings near Harley Street. The physician had relocated to London to better support the ongoing investigations, leaving his practice in Blackmore to a younger colleague. He claimed the change was necessary for his work, but Evangeline suspected he had grown too fond of metropolitan intellectual stimulation to return to provincial life. "I have news," he announced as they climbed the stairs to his apartment. "A letter arrived this morning from the American Women's Suffrage Association. They're requesting that you speak at their convention in New York." Evangeline paused on the landing, startled by the invitation. Her advocacy work had focused primarily on industrial reform rather than women's rights explicitly, though she understood how the two issues intersected. Her transformation from silent wife to public figure had inspired women across England and beyond who sought their own voices in political discourse. "They've heard about the committee testimony?" she asked. "More than that. Your methods, using documented evidence, survivor testimony, and public pressure to force institutional change, have captured attention among reformers worldwide. They want to learn from your approach." The prospect both thrilled and intimidated her. 6 months ago, she could barely order tea without stammering. Now she was being invited to address international audiences on strategies for social reform. The transformation still felt surreal, as if she was inhabiting someone else's life. "I'm not qualified to advise suffragettes," she protested. "My success was largely accidental, the right evidence at the right moment when public opinion was prepared to listen." Dr. Ashford smiled knowingly. "That's exactly what qualifies you. You understand how change actually happens, not through grand speeches or abstract principles, but through patient documentation of specific injustices that ordinary people can comprehend and condemn." That evening, alone in her modest lodgings near Bloomsbury, Evangeline sat at her writing desk composing letters to survivors scattered across England. Many had found new lives, new purposes, new reasons for hope. Others struggled with physical ailments caused by toxic exposure or psychological scars from their captivity. She tried to maintain contact with all of them, understanding that her own healing was intertwined with theirs. Sarah's latest letter lay open beside her writing materials, filled with news from the Blackmore Cooperative and plans for expansion into adjacent communities. The girl who had once cowered in underground chambers now served as elected representative for factory workers, her experiences having transformed her into a formidable advocate for industrial democracy. "We've received inquiries from textile workers in Manchester," Sarah had written. "They want to know how we achieved ownership transfer without violence or legal complications. I told them it required finding the right advocate at the right moment, someone who understood that reform serves everyone's interests, even those who initially resist it." The comment made Evangeline smile. Sarah had learned the same lesson she had discovered through painful experience, that sustainable change required building coalitions rather than simply defeating enemies. Even former opponents could become allies when presented with evidence that reform served their long-term interests. A knock at her door interrupted her correspondence. The visitor proved to be Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, Margaret's sister, who had traveled from Surrey to meet the woman who had avenged her sibling's murder. The two women had corresponded regularly, but had never met face to face. Catherine proved to be an older version of Margaret, intelligent, compassionate, but haunted by questions about her sister's final months. "I knew something was wrong," she confessed over tea. Margaret's letters had become strange, full of hints and half-statements that made no sense. "I should have visited, should have investigated." "You couldn't have known," Evangeline assured her. "Margaret was being watched constantly. Any unusual visitors would have increased the danger to both of you." They spent hours discussing Margaret's character, her hopes for reform, her gradual recognition that her husband was not the man she had married. Catherine had brought additional letters and documents that filled gaps in Evangeline's understanding of the first Mrs. Blackwood's investigation. "She would have admired what you accomplished," Catherine said as she prepared to leave. "Margaret always believed that patient documentation could overcome institutional indifference. You proved her right. After Catherine departed, Evangeline returned to her writing desk, but found herself unable to concentrate on correspondence. Instead, she pulled out the original letter that had started everything. Margaret's desperate note hidden in a poetry book, pleading for someone to hear the voices crying through the walls. The letter was water-stained now, damaged by her flight through flooded tunnels, but every word remained legible. Reading it again, Evangeline was struck by how much had changed since that first discovery. Margaret had died believing her investigation was futile, that powerful men would successfully suppress uncomfortable truths. Yet her carefully preserved evidence had ultimately brought down the system that destroyed her. The following morning brought news that the Select Committee had voted to recommend comprehensive industrial reform legislation. The proposed laws would require independent oversight of mining operations, mandate health protections for workers, and establish legal penalties for exploitation that had previously been ignored. Implementation would take years, and enforcement would face constant challenges, but the foundation for systemic change had been established. Evangeline read the newspaper accounts while having breakfast at her usual coffee house near the British Museum. Other patrons occasionally recognized her, nodding respectfully or offering brief words of support. She had become accustomed to such attention, though it still felt strange to be acknowledged as a public figure. Mrs. Blackwood? A young woman approached her table nervously. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I wanted to thank you for what you've done. My sister worked in a textile mill where conditions were similar to what you described at Blackmore. After your testimony became public, the owners instituted safety improvements and wage increases. They said they didn't want to face the kind of scrutiny you brought to industrial practices. The encounter reinforced Evangeline's understanding that reform's true measure lay not in legislative victories but in concrete improvements to individual lives. Each worker who received better treatment, each facility that improved conditions to avoid scandal, each employer who chose ethical practices over exploitation represented meaningful progress. As spring turned toward summer, Evangeline found herself facing a decision about her future direction. The immediate crisis that had driven her advocacy was resolved. Aldrich was imprisoned, the tunnels were sealed, the survivors had been compensated and relocated. But the broader issues that had enabled such exploitation persisted throughout English society. She could return to private life, perhaps marry again, and seek the domestic tranquility that had originally brought her to Blackmore. The inheritance from Aldrich's estate provided financial security, and her notoriety would eventually fade if she withdrew from public attention. Alternatively, she could accept the growing number of invitations to speak, write, and advocate for industrial reform across England and beyond. The work would be challenging and sometimes dangerous. Powerful interests opposed change, and reformers often faced intimidation, or worse. The decision crystallized one evening as she walked past the Houses of Parliament, their windows glowing in the twilight. Tomorrow, members would debate the industrial reform legislation recommended by the Select Committee. Some would speak passionately about protecting worker rights. Others would argue for maintaining competitive advantages through reduced regulation. But absent from the debate would be the voices of those most affected by the proposed changes, the workers themselves, whose testimony had been filtered through advocates and representatives. The system that had enabled Aldrich's crimes was fundamentally unchanged. Decisions about ordinary people's lives were still made by extraordinary people who rarely faced the consequences of their choices. Evangeline realized that her true calling was not simply exposing individual injustices, but amplifying voices that the system preferred to ignore. Margaret had tried to speak for captive workers, but had been silenced before her message could be heard. Sarah and the other survivors had told their stories, but only after finding an advocate who could translate their experiences into language that power understood. The pattern suggested a role that transcended any single scandal or reform campaign, serving as a bridge between those who suffered from systemic failures and those with authority to address them. It was work that required not just courage, but the particular skills she had developed through adversity: careful documentation, patient investigation, and the ability to speak uncomfortable truths in settings where such truths were unwelcome. That night, she wrote letters accepting speaking invitations in Manchester, Birmingham, and eventually New York. She also began planning a book about her experiences, not a memoir of personal transformation, but a practical guide for others seeking to document and expose institutional injustices. The final chapter would be dedicated to Margaret Blackwood and all the other voices that had been silenced before their messages could be heard. Because Evangeline understood now that her greatest achievement was not learning to speak without stammering, but learning to listen to those who had no voice at all. In the margin of her manuscript, she wrote a dedication: "To all who tap messages through walls, and all who choose to answer." The revolution would be neither violent nor sudden, but it would be thorough. One voice at a time, one story at a time, one injustice exposed at a time, the silence that protected exploitation would be broken, and in its place would rise something England had never quite managed before: a society that valued human dignity above human profit. The transformation was just beginning.